Hi and welcome to the Gemhawks YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day today. For our free tutorial this week, I'd like to share with you my mirror frame pendant. It's so called because it kind of reminds me of the evil queen's mirror in Snow White. Let's head down to the board, take a closer look at the example, and then we'll make one together. I have a couple of examples here of the mirror frame pendant design, and there's a lovely large rounded one, and then there's a slightly more diminutive one in that teardrop shape. So we'll just pop those up to the top. If you're good with resin, you could of course set something in the middle there. The beads that I'm using today are multi-tonal natural tiger's eye. They're 4mm with a 0.8mm space in the middle. I will be working with 2 gauges of wire today. Some 1.25 or 16 gauge, and then some 0.8 or 20 gauge. Now these wires will give your hands a little bit of a workout, but it's really well worth it because you get such a sturdy design. And then these little sections that go around the outside don't move around. If you're tempted to do this with a lighter wire, where I've used the 0.8 or 20 gauge, you won't get that same sturdy effect. So to begin with, dependent on the size of the pendant you wish to create, we're using that 1.25, 16 gauge wire, and I have a 10-inch length here, so I would say 10 to 15-inch length would be perfect for designs of this kind of size. If you want something much larger, then obviously you'll need to size that up. Now this is a sturdy wire, and it's January in the UK, so it's a little bit on the nippy side, so it does really pay to make sure that that's as fluid as you can possibly get it to be. Now I'll replicate a teardrop, but I'll make one that's ever so slightly larger than the teardrop I have on the board right now. So I'm going to grab in one of my mandrels from Beaded and just find the centre of that section of wire and just cross those over around that section in the middle of the wire. So you've got a beautiful elongated teardrop there. I might make that slightly more closed up just by crossing those ends over. You can do that with anything that is sturdy and round that you have at home that you could use to create something like this. So what we're going to do then is bring in our second set of wire, which is 0.8mm or 20 gauge wire. And this is around about a 12 to 15 inch length, and that will be more than adequate for the piece that I have on the board here. If you are making a significantly larger piece, then consider sizing that up. You'll always find uses for these small leftover sections. If you cut too much, don't worry, but it does need to be a cut length. You can't work from the reel for this one. So what we're going to do is just warm through the first couple of inches of that wire and start by laying it over on one of those shoulder pieces of the design. So what I tend to do is take about 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch and just lay it over the top of that design. Now in order for you to see things a little bit more clearly, what I'm going to do is open out that design. I'm very carefully just opening out the 2 ends so that there's a space down the centre, and this will enable us to wrap in a beautifully long seamless fashion. So if I just rotate the pendant around so it's upside down, what we're going to do is move the wire away from the main part of the design to begin with, lay between 1/2 and 3/4 of an inch of the finer wire over the top, and just get a nice casting on point. So this is a sturdy wire, but it does give you this lovely substantial feel. So you may find that you need to use a tool to help you get that really nice, neat rotation of wire around the heavier frame. Now what you'll be able to see there is that there's a bit of a gap. Very common when working with a heavier wire. So we're just going to gently close that up, but we're not going to compress on the coil just yet until we move that down into position. So what I'm looking for is to have 3 visible wraps around that core, which is our frame wire, and then a 4th visible wrap creating the tail of wire coming away, and you'll see that the cut end is moving towards the cut end of my frame wire. Once that's sitting in position, just past the point at which those 2 ends cross over, and if you're making a circular form, you would still need to just open those out at the top to give yourself that access point, but you'll wind on just past the point where the wires cross over. And then what we're going to do is to make sure that that's a really lovely tight coil, and also ensure that the cut end is sitting flat to the body of that core wire. We're then going to just make sure that the grip is comfortable for us to work. Let's get those out of the way. Smooth through the first couple of inches only. We're just working with this wire a little by little. We don't want to overstress it. So I'm bringing in the cut end of my 0.8 or 20 gauge wire, and I'm going to grab a random set of 3 beads from my tray. Now you could use slightly larger beads if you wanted to. These are 4mm multi-tonal natural tiger's eye, but they do have an aperture large enough to go onto that 0.8 or 20 gauge wire. So do just check that before you start moving. Make sure your beads will go on. Let's zip line them down into position. Now, any bead will have the capacity to be fractured. Tiger's eye is not the hardest material on the planet, but it is generally quite nice to work with. I've just noticed that the cut end of my wire is visible on the front of my pendant, and I definitely don't want that. So if you find that when you get your beads onto the wire and the beads are sitting out and away from that frame, you can just move that, rotate. You can move that spiral around slightly, rotate it into position so that the cut end of the wire isn't visible from the front. Ideally, we want it snuggled away where it can't be seen and sitting so smoothly to that core wire that it doesn't stand a chance of catching on skin or clothes. If you've moved that slightly, you can just arch that up until it sits back in position. We're going to initially bring those 3 beads down quite close to the edge of our frame, but what we need to do is start to make a little arc, like a little rainbow over the top. But if you do that really, really tightly, you do stand the chance of shattering the beads that you're working with. Tiger's eye does have the ability to fracture, but so do crystals, beads, any bead really, when you've got nice hard wire like this going through the middle. So what we're going to do is to start creating that little rainbow shape just by using your thumbnail to allow a little bit of space between each bead as you work. So allow that to create the shape for you. The tail of wire, we want to come down underneath the frame. It begins on the frame and then goes over the top of the frame. Draw that around in a nice little rainbow without putting too much stress on those beads. Allow a little bit of space between them as you create that arc. Get that to sit neatly into position. And what we're going to do now is to use that gap we created between those 2 upright sections. So if I flip the design over, I'm going to show you the motion. You're going to hold your rainbow in position, and then we're going to loop the tail of the wire underneath the opposite tail of the heavy frame so that it can pass inside that central cavity. And then if we bring you back around like so, you'll see that that's going to loop and create a spiral on the frame wire. So let's bring you back to the front of that pendant. It becomes a really nice, easy to recreate motion. Your finer wire, in this case 0.8 or 20 gauge, comes from the top, around in an arc shape and underneath. You'll then need to circle 3 times around on that frame. So again, if I take that to the back of the design, bring the wire over and then just loop around that tail so that it's free to move inside the center of your frame. Showing you again the front, and you'll see that it's very easy to make some little gaps in there. So protect your beads and tighten those up as you move through. You're going to need to repeat that another 2 times. So you can see that you don't have to flip the design over. The reason I flipped it to begin with was to show you how the wire moves. And you'll see that it starts to get this little sort of wrinkled effect because it's getting some action along the electrons that all join together in copper wire, which is why it's such a good conductor. So it gets a little bit harder just here. So let's take a look at the front side. Again, you've still got the capacity to just ooch that up slightly if you need to. And what we're going to do is just to warm through the next couple of inches. Only do a couple of inches at a time, and then you shouldn't have too much work to kind of create that little shape. So all you will do is repeat the same technique all the way around until you get to the equal position on the other side, and you may need to just tighten up those little rainbows of wire or pull them out ever so slightly to make sure that you get a nice symmetrical fit. Now, when you're working with that 0.8 or 20 gauge wire, it is a little bit more brutal on the fingers and wrists. So just take your time and only warm up the first couple of inches of that wire, and you will find it a little bit more fluid to make those beautiful arc shapes. Once you've got to the other shoulder, whether you're making an oval or even if you go for round like I have shown you below, or the teardrop shape, just when you get to the other side, we're going to bring around so that we've got 4 visible wraps so that it matches the first side, and then trim away. I'm going to show you a common pitfall next so that you can fix that on the fly. So what you may find is that your start point and your end point aren't exactly equal. Rather than trying to scooch the wire all the way round, you can reintroduce your round form, just cross the wires over a little bit more at the top. And then when you unfurl them, if you need to unfurl them, you can just push them into the shape that means that those start points and end points match up properly. So I've just left the last little bit of wire attached so that we can trim that away together on the rear of the design, and there's quite a lot of wire left over, but that is very, very useful, especially if you recreate matching earrings. Now with the earrings, you could theoretically use a 1mm or 18 gauge wire instead of that 1.25 16 gauge, as it will make it slightly lighter, but it's much easier to deform the overall shape that you're going for. So if you do go for smaller ones, you've got uses for those bits of offcuts. Now we've got a sticky uppy bit on the end here. If I show you that little bit of light glinting, there is where the cut end is sitting away from that core. So we're just going to rotate the pliers around until that smooths down. Now I'm not pressing very hard, but what you'll find is that it smooths that cut end down, so there's less of a glinting circle and more of just a little gentle point of light. So this is the rear of the design. Let's flip that over. So just by opening and closing, you can make sure that those 2 bits sit opposite and equal to one another so that you have symmetry. Now the number of beads I've used, it really does depend again on the size of the beads. These are 4mm. I've used 21 in this one. I think there are 24 here, and there are 15 on this small one, just to give you an idea. So let's scooch those over to the corner for now. What we're going to do is make sure that we're happy with how everything is looking. I really like the teardrop shape for this design. If it's come out of true, you can just very gently modify that until it sits exactly how you want it to. What we're going to do is to take one of these wires, and I've just closed that back up so they're a little bit closer together. We're going to make one of them into an upright. So just pull that so that it sits at the 12 o'clock position, going directly upwards. And then the other wire we're going to make form across that angle change. So if I grip the wire just like so, I'm leaving a tiny gap between the end of the wrap and where my pliers are sitting, and bringing that all the way across so that it intersects with where we change the angle on the first wire. Now to stop this from wiggling around too much, what I'm going to do is just flip this over to the side where the straight out to the side wire is, and I'm going to grip across that angle change and just push that forward. So if I hold this upright, if I push that forwards, we've got a little bit of wire going straight across the back, blurry because it's just above the focal zone, straight across sideways, and let's bring that back round to the front. And what that means is when I grip those 2 side by side wires together up at the 12 o'clock position, and I bring the tail of wire all the way around, what will happen is that everything will stay in the right position. If you don't have that tiny bit of flat wire across the back, what can happen is as you pull this wire around the upright core, it will start to use parts of the wire on the side, and then you don't have that lovely symmetrical part. Now you do need a bit of grip strength here just to ensure everything stays put whilst you bring those tails around. And I'm going to go for 3 wraps on that upright. Make sure everything is where I want it to be. You can tighten up the coil if it's slightly loosened. So if I put the pliers underneath the coil on one side, over the top of the coil on the other side, and just compress that so it sits really neatly, and then I'm just going to put as much warmth as I can into this sideways facing piece of wire right now. Just get that nice and smooth. So you can see we've got a symmetrical design now. In my round example, I had an equal number of those little rainbows, so there are 4 on either side, which is one form of symmetry, sort of equal and opposite. And then I have got this divided symmetry, so there's an odd number of rainbows on this one. So the central bottom, the 6 o'clock position opposite our bail, is the middle of one of those rainbows. So it doesn't matter how many you fit, there's always a way to make it look symmetrical. What we're going to do now is create a hanging loop, or a bail if you prefer. So just make sure you're happy with your wrapping here. Bring that down into position, make sure all is tickety-boo. What we're going to do is add some warmth through this section up at the top. And then I'm going to grip across that upright with my flat facing, my bent chain nose pliers, and just push that forwards. Doesn't need to be all the way to 90 degrees, about 45 degrees is plenty. We're then going to grab another one of those round mandrel forms. So this is quite a large form that I'm using. You could use a pencil, you could use your bail making pliers. I'm using the wooden mandrels today, and I'm just going to take that tail all the way around. So you could go for a much smaller hanging loop if you prefer. It's really what you're looking for as to how large you want this space to be on your design. I think actually that probably is a little bit large. I might make it slightly smaller. So if you don't have something that's exactly the right size, you can make that ever so slightly smaller just by moving your pliers little by little, and we've still got a really good looking bail, ever so slightly smaller, without having an exact sized tool. So let's just draw that wire forwards again. Grip hold of your circular form all the way across. You can use nylon jaw pliers if you don't want any tool marks on it. And we're just going to draw the tail of the wire all the way around to fill the gap on the upright. Now, if I do that once, I've still got a bit of wire left that's bare in the middle here. Just open that up with my nail, you can see there. What I'd like to do is add some spirals on the front of my design, but my wires aren't the same length. So the longer tail, which I've used to create those wraps down close to tying the bits together at the top, that's got more wire available. So I'm going to use that one again to rotate the wire all the way around and fill that last gap. So if I just push that into position, you can see how much shorter that's got. Let's tighten it up and make sure that it sits in home as close as possible. Push that nice and flat. Now those two tails are much closer in size, so I'm going to trim them both to the same size, and there's a little bit of a jagged edge on the shorter one, so I'm going to trim a tiny bit away there as well. Just putting my finger over the top to stop it pinging up into the camera again. And you can see now we've got these two shorter length wires. So I'm just going to make sure that my bail neck section is nice and straight and strong, and that those wraps are as tight as I can get them. And then I'll show you how you can add some further detail if you want to add some spirals up at the top here. One of the reasons I like to add spirals to my design at the neckline is to help people who are newer to wrapping with wire, because it means that you can hide any slightly wiggly lines, or if you're not 100% certain about how that little bail looks, you can add a little bit of detail just to add detail, or indeed to hide a little bit of squishy wire. So I'll take you back down to the board and you can choose whether you want a single spiral or a double spiral on the front of your pendant at the bail. So if you just want a single spiral up on your bail, what you would need to do is take one of these wires around to the rear of the design and cut it halfway across the back, and then use that twisting technique that I showed you earlier just to smooth that end down and have it be sat really firmly and neatly and smoothly against that core wire. What I'm going to show you now is a double opposing coil up at the top. Just going to put a little bit of warmth into these sections of wire. Now don't scratch yourself or cut yourself. What you can do is literally just hold those pieces of wire and you will still be able to put a little bit of intention of warmth into them. Just going to gently open them out so it's easier to gain access, and just using a standard pair of round nose pliers, we're going to start by rotating that wire around slowly. When you're making coils, the slower you go, the neater they are. So I've started with a circular form that doesn't quite close. What we're going to do then is switch to some bent chain nose pliers. Any flat facing pliers will do. And I'm going to push that spiral into my non-dominant finger just to receive that spiral and make that sit really close to the end point at the bail. So just keep bringing that around tiny part by tiny part until it sits in the middle of that bail. So you may need to just give that a little bit of pressure and hold the bail central whilst you bring that last bit in, like so. And what you'll notice is that the spiral is sticking out at 90 degrees to that core wire. Just leave it until you're ready. Make sure that you're happy with its position. And then what we're going to do is push it against the bail on the upper spiral, and you can make sure that that's nice and central. Just adds a little bit of detail to your bail as well, so it's not just a single plain piece of wire. And you can see that that's slightly on the wonk, so I'm just going to straighten that up. To use the second piece of wire, little bit of warmth again, and start drawing that upwards and around so that you get a nice spiral. Again, I haven't created the whole circular form yet. I'm going to push that into the remainder of that wire. You can tighten it up a little bit if you need to, and just keep moving that until it sits snugly against that central core wire up at the top of the neckline. Again, you need a little bit of grip strength for this design. You can work with 18 gauge 1mm if you need to, but just be aware that when you're adding these extra layers, it will start to come out of true. So the other option is to create your form and hammer it in that 1mm or 18 gauge, but don't hammer the end wires because you'll need them to be fluid to achieve this. So again, that spiral sticking out at a jaunty 90-degree angle, you can just push that down with your thumb. So I have arthritis in my left wrist and a couple of fingers and a couple of other places, because obviously, and what I can still achieve by warming that wire before I try to move it is really quite a lot. So hopefully you will be able to have a go at this design as well. So you've got some choices and sizes. You can go for ovals, you can really do whatever shape you fancy, to be perfectly honest, but it's a joy to work with. I really enjoyed the mirror frame pendant, and I hope that you do too. Lots of choices in how you can enhance this design as well. You can set something in the middle, you can go for different numbers other than 3, but using that slightly heavier wire around the outside of the frame gives you a really sturdy framed design. Thank you so much for continuing to watch me here at the Gemhawks YouTube channel. Don't forget that a like, a comment and a subscription really does help the channel be seen. So if you're not yet subscribed, I tend to upload only once a week, and I promise not to bombard you with extraneous information. Have yourself a lovely day, and I look forward to seeing you back here very soon. Bye for now.